looking at the cardiovascular system. We're going to start by looking at the heart and the anatomy and the physiology of it. You, unfortunately, will probably be dealing with a lot of abnormalities, diseases, etc., associated with both the heart and the cardiovascular system throughout your career in the health field. So it's important that you understand what the normal functioning, normal anatomy is, so you understand when abnormality. With the heart anatomy, we're going to start looking at that first. Understand that the heart is essentially a pump. And you have two components to it. It's like you have two smaller pumps side by side. And the circulatory system is going to be divided into two components, the pulmonary and the systemic circulatory system. So the right side of the heart is going to be receiving blood from throughout the body, other than the lungs. And this blood that is returning to the heart on the right side is very low in oxygen. It's very high in CO2, but very low in oxygen. And this will form the pulmonary circuit or the pulmonary circulation pathway. It is going, the right side of the heart will then pump that blood to the lungs and then back to the left side of the heart. So when the blood goes to the lungs, it essentially unloads the CO2 and it loads or picks up the oxygen. So, like I said, blood coming from the rest of the body comes to the right side. It's low in oxygen, gets pumped to the lungs via the pulmonary circuit, returns to the left side of the heart. This blood is now highly oxygenated, which means it has a high concentration of oxygen, very low in CO2. And now the left side of the heart will pump the blood out the aorta to the systemic circuit or systemic circulation pathway, which is everywhere else. There are chambers in the heart. The chambers on the upper part of the heart that are receiving the blood are known as the atrium. So you have the right atrium, you have the left atrium. So the right atrium is receiving blood from systemic, and the left atrium is receiving blood from the pulmonary circuit. And then the lower chambers beneath the atriums are the ventricles. These are the pumping chambers. So they're responsible for pumping the blood out of the heart on the right side to the pulmonary circuit and on the left side. So in this diagram, you can see how the blood is arriving to the heart on the right side and then leaves, goes to the lungs. You'll notice that it is colored in blue, indicating that it is oxygen poor, CO2 is carbon dioxide rich. And then on the red is going to be coming to the left side of the heart and then being pumped out systemically. It is red because it is oxygen rich and CO2 poor. Remember, when we are talking about the right and left, it is always the patient's right and left, not your right and left. The heart is about the size of your fist. It weighs less than a pound. It's located in the mediastinum, roughly between your second rib and the fifth intercostal space. It is resting on top of the diaphragm, so it's superior to the surface of your diaphragm. It is not exactly in the middle. It is more towards the left of your mid-sternal line. That's why, actually, yes, it's true, your left lung is slightly smaller than your right lung to make room for the heart. Showing the placement of the heart. And from looking down at the heart as well. The base, which is the posterior cervix, kind of leans towards the right shoulder. The apex points down to the left hip. Excuse me. So once again, showing the position of it. The pericardium is the double wall sac that's surrounding the heart. It's made up of 2 layers. The superficial fibrous pericardium, it helps to protect the heart, helps to anchor the heart to the surrounding structures, and it prevents it from overfilling. The deeper layer of serous pericardium, you've got 2 layers actually composing it, the parietal layer and then the visceral or epicardium, which is the external surface of the heart itself. The parietal layer is outermost of those 2, and between them is the pericardial cavity. It is filled with fluid to help decrease friction. So here you can see the various layers in the myocardium. This is the heart muscle itself. So you can see in the enlarged picture where you have the heart chamber, then the endocardium, the myocardium, which is the heart muscle, the epicardium, which is the visceral layer of the serous pericardium, and then the pericardial cavity that would be filled with fluid, and then the parietal layer, and then the fibrous pericardium. Pericarditis is inflammation of the pericardium. It's going to, when you cause a noise, a creaking sound, when you listen with a stethoscope, you're going to feel it's going to be sore. If you have excess fluid that leaks into that pericardial space, that is going to interfere with the heart's pumping ability, and so the treatment is going to be you've got to withdraw that fluid. You must get rid of it. Usually they'll use it. So it's 3 layers of the heart, or the epicardium, the myocardium. Epicardium is the visceral layer, as we just said. The myocardium, that is the cardiac muscle. It's kind of that's the response for the pumping action, and it's in circular little bundles. You do have some crisscrossing of connective tissue embedded, which is going to help anchor and secure those cardiac muscle fibers. It's going to help support the blood vessels, the valves, and it is going to help basically control and limit the way the action moves. So this shows the bundles of the cardiac. And the innermost layer is the endocardium. And this is what's lining the heart chambers, and on there once again. So the internal features, you've got, as I said, those 4 chambers. The superior ones are the atrium, the inferior ones are the ventricles. Between the atrium, you have the interatrial septum. There is what we call a fossa ovalis. This is a remnant of the foramen ovale, which is found in the fetal heart at birth. Basically, it's a hole that connects the 2 atriums together. In fetal circulation, because the mother is providing all the oxygen and getting rid of the CO2 waste, obviously in utero, in the uterus, the developing fetus is not breathing on its own. So there's really no reason for all of the blood to go to the right ventricle, to the lungs, and then back. Yes, some blood has to go to the lungs to keep the tissue itself supplied with oxygen and nutrients, etc. But not all of the blood needs to be oxygenated there. And so there's kind of a bypass system. There's this little hole that goes, the blood coming into the right atrium can pass through this hole that goes between the atriums. So it goes from the right atrium directly to the left atrium without ever going to the lungs. At birth, when a baby takes its first breath, there's a flap and it's going to close. And the remnants of that are the fossa ovalis. The intraventricular septum is the tissue that is going to be separating the 2 ventricles from each other. So you can see on this schematic drawing of the heart, once again, it's the patient's right and left. So you can see mark the fossa ovalis in the right atrium. You can definitely see the intraventricular septum between the ventricles. You'll notice that it's fairly thick, but remember that the ventricles are the pumping action. That's what they're responsible, is pumping that blood. So it's very muscular on that portion of the heart as compared to the atrium. On the surface features, you have the coronary sulcus. This is a groove between the atrium and the ventricles. It's also sometimes known as your atrioventricular groove. And you'll notice that oftentimes blood vessels that are servicing or providing the heart itself with oxygen nutrients often lie in this sulcus. The anterior interventricular sulcus, excuse me, is basically lying in the interventricular septum area. And then the posterior interventricular sulcus is on the back lower side as well. And so here on the front, you can see the sulcus, and notice that, like I said, the arteries and veins that are supplying the heart itself often are lying in these, in the anterior and then in the posterior view. The atrium, these are the receiving chambers, as we said earlier. The walls tend to be thinner because they don't have to pump. They're just receiving the blood. They're smaller than the ventricles. So they are receiving the blood either from the lungs or from the rest of the body. The right atrium is receiving that deoxygenated blood from the body. There are 3 veins that are going to empty into the right atrium. You have the superior vena cava. This is bringing blood from all the body regions above the diaphragm. The inferior vena cava is returning blood from everything below the diaphragm. And then the third vessel, veins are those blood vessels that return blood to the heart. So the third vein is the coronary sinus. This is returning blood from the coronary, from the heart itself. Those blood vessels that are feeding the heart itself, this is how the blood returns. It's via the coronary sinus. Let me just mention here that some people, especially if they're looking at diagrams, want to say that, well, the veins are blue and the arteries are red. Yes and no. That's not going to hold true with the pulmonary circulation. So I always prefer that you just think of it as veins are returning blood to the heart. Arteries are taking blood away from the heart. Now the left atrium is receiving oxygenated blood from the lungs. So remember, the blood has already gone to the lungs and it's picked up more oxygen. And you've got the pulmonary veins, there's 4 of them. You've got 2 from the right lung and 2 from the left lung. So that's what's going to be draining into the left atrium as seen here. The ventricles, these, as I said earlier, they're the pumps or the discharging chambers. They're larger than the atrium, so they're going to take up more volume of the heart. The right ventricle is mostly on the anterior surface. The left ventricle is the posterior and inferior surface. You do have these ridges of muscle along the ventricular walls. You have papillary muscles that extend into the cavity of the ventricles. They help to anchor what's known as the chordae tendae. These are attached to the heart valves between the atrium and the ventricles. It helps prevent them from flapping back. Essentially, it's helping to hold them in place. If you look at the walls of the ventricles, they are thicker than the atrium. As I said, they are the actual pumps. The right ventricle has to pump that blood into the pulmonary trunk, and then the left ventricle has to pump the blood into the aorta. The aorta is the largest artery that's found in the body. So as you can see here, the pulmonary trunk, from the right ventricle, the blood is going to pass through the pulmonary valves into that pulmonary trunk, which very shortly will then separate or branch into the left pulmonary artery and the right pulmonary artery. And it's a large blue vessel on the right of the picture. The left ventricle is going to be pumping the blood through the pulmonary or through the aortic valve into the aorta, which is, as we said, the largest artery in the body. And then shortly after, there are branches off from it. This is a picture of an actual heart where you can see from the cross-section certain other structures like the fossa ovarialis, the myocardium of the left ventricle. Here's another aspect. One thing to notice on here, it is drawn in the schematic drawings, but you can also see on this heart, notice that the muscle on the left ventricle, the walls of the left ventricle, that muscle is much thicker than on the right ventricle. This is because the right ventricle only has to pump right next door to the lungs, and that's it. But the left ventricle has to pump to the rest of the body. It's got to be able to pump that blood with enough force that it can send it all the way down to your feet and get it back to the heart. So the left side is much stronger because it has to be able to pump that blood a farther distance. And so the muscle that has to be stronger, the muscle is thicker on. And here you can see the right coronary artery that's lying in the coronary sulcus. So how do you make sure the blood doesn't backflow? How do you keep it moving in one direction? Well, in the heart, you're going to have valves. There are 4 valves. They're responding to pressure changes, so they're going to open and close. There are 2 main types of valves. We have the atrioventricular valves, as the name implies, atrioventricular. It's between the atrium and the ventricles. And then we have the semilunar valves. The semilunar valves are located between the ventricles and the major arteries. There's no valve between the major veins and coming into the atrium. You don't really need it because there's enough movement of the blood, it prevents backflow. And there are valves embedded within the vein for backflow. So this is showing the AV or atrioventricular valves and the semilunar valves. And of course, we're going to give them specific names. So your AV valves, the purpose is when they open, blood is going to flow from the atrium down into the ventricles. And then when they close, it's going to prevent the blood from backflowing back up into the atrium. On the right side of the heart, the right AV valve is known as the tricuspid valve. It has 3 flaps, if you will. The left AV valve is known as the mitral valve. It's also known as the bicuspid valve. You have, with AV valves, these, they look like flaps that kind of anchor them to the papillary muscles. It's going to help hold the valves in the proper position. It prevents the flaps from moving backwards or flapping backwards into the atrium. So basically, the chordae tendae help to position and keep the valves positioned and operating properly. So tricuspid on the right, bicuspid on. This shows a picture showing those chordae tendae and the papillary muscles on both the picture as well as on a dissected heart. The chordae tendae look like little, they're very easy to see when you do a dissection. They look like little threads, little strings, if you will. So blood, when it returns to the heart from either systemic or pulmonary, it's going to fill up the atrium and it's going to press against those AV valves, increasing the pressure that's going to force the valves to open. And then the ventricles, as they fill, the AV valves are going to be just kind of hanging there, and then you have the pumping action that moves. And we'll talk later about when the valves open, when they close, and what is controlling that. Once again, here is showing a cross-section on this diagram, and with the AV valves, you can definitely see the mitral or the bicuspid has 2 cusps, and the tricuspid has. Semilunar valves, or the SL valves, they prevent backflow from the major arteries back down into the ventricles. So they're going to also open and close, responding to pressure changes. Each of the semilunar valves have 3 cusps. They kind of look like a half moon, which is how it's named. The pulmonary semilunar valve is going to be between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk, and then the aortic semilunar valve is between the left ventricle and the aorta. And that is showing here that as the ventricles contract, pressure rises, the blood's pushed up against the semilunar valves, and that's going to force them to open. And then as the ventricles relax and the pressure then drops, it's going to force the valves then to close. There are different conditions that can weaken the heart, incompetent valves, so that if the valve's not working properly, you can have blood backflowing. That's making the heart work really hard because it has to repump the same blood over and over and over, and that's a lot of stress to add to the heart. You can also have a situation, valvular stenosis, where the flaps get stiff, and so then they're not able to open as well. So now the heart needs to also pump harder to force the blood through. Defective valves can be replaced with by surgery with either a mechanical valve, animal, or cadaver. So in terms of the pathway of blood through the heart, the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus are the 3 main veins bringing blood back to the heart. It's going to come into the right atrium. It will then pass through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. From there, it's going to pass through the pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary trunk. And then you have that split, and there's going to go to the pulmonary arteries, the left pulmonary artery and the right pulmonary artery, to the right and the left lungs. From the lungs, the blood becomes oxygenated, so it gets rid of the CO2, picks up oxygen, and then you've got your 4 pulmonary veins, 2 from the right and 2 from the left lung, coming together, and all 4 of those will drain into the left atrium. The blood then will flow through the mitral valve into the left ventricle, through the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta, and then up around into systemic circulation, go throughout the body, come back via the superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, and start the whole process over again. So this is showing, once again, that the heart everyone tends to know that it's heart, but it's a double pump. So here it is showing what we just went over, the blood coming in, right atrium, through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, pulmonary trunk to exchange of oxygen. It is going to then come back from the lungs to the left atrium via the pulmonary veins, through the mitral or bicuspid valve, you can use either name, to the left ventricle, through the aortic semilunar valve, to the aorta, to the systemic circulation, and then start all over. And this just shows. So basically, once again, you've got these 2 circuits. Blood coming to the right side of the heart, to the pulmonary circuit, to the left side of the heart, systemic, heart, lungs, heart, systemic, heart, lungs, etc. So about equal volume of blood is being pumped through the pulmonary and systemic circuits. Pulmonary circuit is very short, low pressure. Like I said, you just need to go right next door. The systemic circuit is very long and high friction. So the ventricles are going to reflect that. Like I said earlier, that left ventricle wall is much, much thicker than the right side because it has to, as you can see here. Coronary circulation, this is what is supplying the heart muscle itself with the blood that's needed. Obviously, it's a very short circulation pattern because it's just right there to the heart. It's delivered when that heart is relaxed, and the left ventricle is receiving most of that blood supply from the muscle. The left and right coronary arteries arise from the base of the aorta, and they're going to supply the blood to the heart. They encircle the heart around the embedded in that or sitting in that coronary sulcus. And then there's branching. The way the branching occurs, there are some variations between individuals, but there's usually a lot of different junctions, basically allowing for additional routes, so that obviously the heart has to get a very good blood supply. The last thing you want is to have a blood clot or blockage occurring in the heart itself. The left coronary artery is going to supply the interventricular septum, the anterior ventricular wall, the left atrium, and the posterior wall of the left ventricle. It has two branches. It has your anterior interventricular artery and the circumflex artery. The right coronary artery supplies the right atrium and thus the right ventricle. It has two branches, the right marginal artery and the posterior interventricular artery. As you can see here, the arteries. The coronary veins, you have the cardiac veins are going to be collecting the blood from all the capillary beds, and then the coronary sinus empties into the right atrium. The coronary sinus is formed by all the cardiac veins merging. You have the great cardiac vein, you have the middle cardiac vein, and small cardiac vein. And this is shown here. So once again, on this picture, the gross anatomy of the heart, this posterior view where you can see the great cardiac vein, middle cardiac vein, you can see the right coronary artery, the coronary sinus as it's going to feed into the right atrium. When there is a deficiency in blood delivery to the myocardium, you may feel this as thoracic pain, cells are weakened, this angina pectoralis. Myocardial infarction or heart attack is when there's prolonged blockage to the heart. Areas of cell death are going to be repaired with scar tissue, not muscle tissue. So damage that's done cannot be repaired. If you listen to the heart sounds, there's two different sounds that are associated with the closing of the heart valves. We often refer to as that lub-dub, that bum-bum. The first sound is the closing of the AV valves at the very beginning of ventricular systole, and then the second sound is the closing of semilunar or SL valves. There is a little bit of a pause in there. The pause is the heart is. The mitral valve, or the bicuspid valve, is going to close just slightly before the tricuspid, and the aortic is going to close just slightly before the pulmonary valve. So you can listen with a stethoscope and place the stethoscope in the four different sounds. So this is showing on this diagram where you would place the stethoscope to listen to hear when each of the separate valves is closing. Heart murmurs, this is an abnormal sound that you hear. Usually it's indicative of a problem with one of the valves. Usually what's happening is the valve is not closing completely, and so there is some backflow, and that sounds like a little swishing sound. Sometimes it can also be due to stenotic valve where the valve fails to open completely, and so you don't have as much blood flow going through the valve, and that sounds more like a clicking sound as the blood's being forced through this narrow space.